Mark's eyes were anxiously scanning the faces of passengers disembarking as he stood by the gate. With each passing minute, the feeling of unease in the pit of his stomach intensified. Ellie should have left the plane by now. Where was she? She's probably just getting her things, he told himself, but that didn't stop the terrible feeling in the pit of his stomach. As the minutes ticked by, his concern only grew. He waited a little bit longer, but that was when a strange feeling crept over him. 20 minutes later, everyone had left the plane. The doors had closed, and there was still no sign of Ellie. Mark's heart raced. He approached a flight attendant. "Have you seen my daughter?" "Ellie Vernhoff." His palms were sweaty, and lots of terrible things were now swirling around in his mind. The flight attendant looked confused, glancing at the empty walkway. "She hasn't gotten off the plane," no. Mark's voice wavered. "She hasn't. Something wasn't right. He had to find her." Mark rushed back toward the gate, pushing through the remaining stragglers. The feeling of unease had turned into full-blown panic. He flagged down an airline employee. "My daughter, Ellie, she's still on the plane. I need to go back on board." The employee frowned, checking the list. "Sir, wait, you can't just barge onto a plane. Please wait." The pilot didn't mention anything. "Let me check." Mark's heart thudded in his chest. Why hadn't Ellie gotten off the plane? What was keeping her there? Something didn't feel right to him. After some back and forth, Mark was allowed to board. He stepped into the now empty cabin, the silence unnerving. Where was she? A flight attendant pointed toward the front of the plane. "Sir, your daughter seems to still be on the plane." Mark's stomach tightened. Why would Ellie still be on the plane? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He took a deep breath and headed toward the cockpit. That was when he heard her voice. "Ellie? Are you in there? Open this door right now." Mark's heart sank as he thought about why Ellie had flown alone. After his divorce from Melissa, they agreed Ellie would split her time between them. It wasn't ideal, but work consumed their lives. Melissa's demanding job and his own career in California kept them apart. Ellie was forced to fly across states for their visits. Mark hated it. He had planned to spoil her during these 2 weeks and take her to Disneyland. But why hadn't she gotten off the plane? Mark's mind drifted to the years leading up to the divorce. Their marriage had been strained for a long time. Melissa's career as a high-powered attorney and his own hectic job meant they rarely saw each other. The distance took its toll, and arguments became more frequent. "We're always working, Mark. We never have time for Ellie, let alone each other," Melissa had said one night, her voice trembling with exhaustion. They had tried to make it work, but the strain was too much. Ellie had been heartbroken when her parents told her about the divorce. At 7 years old, she didn't fully understand why they couldn't just stay together. She had cried, begged them to try harder, but in the end, it didn't change things. Over time, Ellie learned to accept the changes. Her weekends were split between her mom and dad, and while it hurt, she found joy in the small things like the trips she took to California. Mark and Melissa had tried to make the best of their co-parenting arrangement. They alternated holidays, and when work allowed, Mark would fly to Ellie. But this time, with their schedules too busy, Ellie had to make the trip alone. Flying by herself felt lonely, but she was brave. She loved visiting her dad and hearing about all the adventures he had planned. She had been looking forward to Disneyland ever since he mentioned it. Back at the airport, Mark stood waiting for his daughter to arrive, his anxiety growing. He was both nervous and excited because he hoped that her first solo flight would go well. He had seen Ellie's brave face before boarding when he called Melissa, but now she was nowhere to be found. Why hadn't she told him about any special activities on the flight? The longer he waited, the more uneasy he felt. All he wanted was to spend these 2 weeks spoiling his little girl. And now, this delay had him more worried than ever. As Mark stood there, waiting to see Ellie's bright smile, his thoughts drifted back to the weeks before the divorce. He remembered how Ellie would ask why he and Melissa never seemed happy together anymore. They had tried to hide their frustrations from her, but children are perceptive. The constant work trips, late nights at the office, and growing distance between them made it impossible to pretend. Ellie sensed everything. Mark remembered the final conversation with Melissa that led to their decision. It had been late, and they were both exhausted after yet another week of missed dinners and empty conversations. "We're not a family anymore," Melissa had said, her voice cracking. "We're just two people with separate lives." This isn't fair to Ellie. As much as Mark wanted to deny it, he knew she was right. The best thing for Ellie was to have two parents who were happy, even if it meant they weren't together. Ellie had struggled at first, adjusting to the new arrangement. She missed having both her parents in the same house. But slowly she began to find her new routine: weekends with Mark, weekdays with Melissa. Mark promised himself that whenever Ellie was with him, he'd make every moment count. This trip to California was going to be special. Disneyland was just the beginning, but now his heart raced with worry. Why hadn't she come off the plane yet? A week before Ellie boarded the plane, Mark called her, excitement bubbling in his voice. "Ellie, I can't wait for you to get here. We're going to Disneyland, and you can have anything you want." Ellie giggled on the other end. "Even a princess dress?" "Especially a princess dress," Mark had replied. He could hear her excitement building. 2 whole weeks to spoil his princess. Nothing could ruin that, or so he thought. The days leading up to Ellie's trip dragged on for Mark. He spent every spare moment planning their adventures, booking tickets, and imagining the look on her face when she walked through Disneyland's gates. Each phone call with Ellie made the distance harder. "I'm going to miss you so much, Daddy," she had said the night before her flight. "You won't miss me long. We'll be together soon, sweetheart," he had assured her. But now, standing at the gate, his heart twisted with worry. On the day Ellie was set to arrive, Mark could barely contain his excitement. He had arrived at the airport early, eager to greet her the second she stepped off the plane. He found a spot near the gate, watching the digital board. Her flight had landed. Soon he would have her in his arms. He adjusted his jacket, pacing back and forth, as families and travelers began to emerge from the gate. Mark scanned the sea of faces. He saw mothers reuniting with their children, couples embracing after time apart, but there was no sign of Ellie. His heart skipped a beat, but he brushed off the feeling. She was probably one of the last to get off. He couldn't contain his excitement. But deep down he was nervous. "Maybe they're helping her with her bags," he muttered to himself, trying to stay calm. She was only 7 after all. However, the minutes dragged on, and as more and more passengers walked past him, Mark felt his anxiety creeping in. Why hadn't she come out yet? She should have been one of the first off the plane. He checked the gate again. The flight attendant stood by, talking to a few stragglers, but Ellie was nowhere to be seen. Mark resolved to wait a little longer. There must be a perfectly reasonable explanation for Ellie not coming out yet. Or S. Mark tried to rationalize the situation. She's probably with the flight attendants, they're just making sure she's safe. But as the clock ticked past the 30-minute mark, his confidence began to wane. He paced the length of the terminal, his hands clenched into fists. Every passing minute felt heavier. Where was his precious daughter? By now Mark was thinking about every inconceivable thought that could have happened to his daughter. His heart was beating out of his chest. 35 minutes. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as his thoughts raced. What could be keeping her so long? He approached a nearby airport employee. "Excuse me, my daughter was supposed to be on this flight. She hasn't come out yet. Is there? Could you check?" His voice wavered, trying to mask his rising panic. Mark knew it was time to ask for help at this point. Something just didn't feel right in the pit of his stomach. The employee offered a polite smile. "What's her name, sir?" "Let's see if I can check what was happening with her flight." "Ellie Vernhoff," Mark replied, barely able to keep still. Sweat was dripping down his forehead, and he couldn't help but be fidgety. The woman typed into her computer. "There's no note about any delays with the unaccompanied minors. Maybe she's just taking her time. I'm sure everything's fine." Mark forced a nod, but the unease gnawed at him. 40 minutes had passed since the plane landed, and now Mark's stomach churned with fear. He approached the gate again, this time more urgently. "Please," he said to the flight attendant. "My daughter hasn't come out yet. She's traveling alone. Ellie Vernhoff." The attendant's smile faltered. She glanced at the list and then toward the empty gate. "She hasn't gotten off yet." No, Mark answered, his voice cracking. "She hasn't." The attendant furrowed her brow and motioned for Mark to wait. She disappeared behind the door to the jet bridge, leaving him alone with his racing thoughts. Mark's mind spun, conjuring every possible explanation. Had she gotten lost on the plane? Was there a mix-up? Was she scared? But none of those thoughts were comforting. He couldn't stop his mind from wandering. What if someone led her by the hand and walked off with her? But Ellie was smart. She wouldn't just walk off with a stranger, would she? The minutes dragged on. Mark felt trapped in limbo, staring at the gate, waiting for anyone to give him an answer. The once bustling terminal had quieted, and now it was nearly empty. His heart pounded in his ears as he thought about Ellie, alone on that plane, wondering why she hadn't been reunited with him yet. He couldn't take it anymore. 45 minutes had passed. He stormed back to the desk, desperate now. "I need to get onto the plane. Please, my daughter is still in there. She's only 7." His voice was shaking. The flight attendant held up her hand. "Sir, please let me check with the crew. There's a process. You can't just barge into an empty plane. It's a huge security risk." After a few tense moments, the attendant returned, looking puzzled. "The crew is still on the plane, but they didn't mention anything about a child. I'll contact them now." Mark's panic intensified. How could they not know where Ellie was? He clenched his fists as he waited, every second feeling like an eternity. The radio buzzed in the attendant's hand. She listened for a moment before her expression became serious. "They're checking the cabin now." Mark felt his legs weaken. How do they not know where she is? He muttered to himself, his worst fears now creeping closer. The attendant gave Mark an apologetic look. "Sir, please remain calm. We're just verifying everything, and I'm sure it's nothing serious. Let me speak with the captain." Mark couldn't wait any longer. "I'm going in," he said, trying to move toward the jet bridge. But the employee blocked him. "Sir, I understand you're worried, but please, we need to follow procedures," the attendant urged. Mark's desperation was obvious, his patience gone. "Just let me go on the plane. My daughter is there, and she's alone," Mark pleaded, barely able to contain his frustration. The attendant hesitated. "All right, let me check with the pilot directly. Please, wait right here." Mark had had enough. "I don't care about procedures," he snapped. "My daughter is still on that plane. I'm going in now." The attendant tried to hold him back, but he brushed her aside and marched toward the jet bridge. His fear had turned to determination. He had to find Ellie no matter what. "Sir, please," the attendant called after him, but Mark wasn't listening anymore. Mark hurried down the aisle, checking the seats, his heart racing with every step. His mind raced with dark possibilities, imagining the worst. Why hadn't anyone found her yet? Ellie, his voice trembled as he called her name again, growing more frantic by the second. Where could she be? As he reached the front of the plane, Mark noticed the cockpit door was slightly ajar. He stopped in his tracks, dread creeping up his spine. Could she be in there? He took a deep breath and stepped closer. That's when he heard Ellie's voice, muffled but unmistakable, coming from behind the door. Mark's heart leaped. He could hear her giggling softly, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. He pushed the door further open, his panic now replaced by confusion. "Ellie? Are you in there, honey? What's going on in there?" There was a moment of silence before he heard her again, this time talking to someone, an adult. Mark's confusion turned to anger. Why was his daughter in the cockpit? Who was with her? His mind filled with 1,000 questions, none of them good. Without waiting another second, he barged into the cockpit, his face flushed with rage. "What are you doing with my daughter?" The pilot turned around, startled by Mark's sudden entrance. The pilot stood there, unfazed, a calm smile on his face. Ellie was sitting in the co-pilot's seat, grinning from ear to ear. "Daddy," she squealed excitedly. Mark, still breathing heavily, took a step back, his anger replaced by confusion. "What's going on here?" The pilot raised his hands in a gesture of reassurance. "Sir, it's okay. Your daughter was curious about the cockpit. She wanted to see what it looked like, so I let her take a quick tour." Mark's anger wavered, but he wasn't convinced. "Why didn't you tell me? I've been out there waiting for her, thinking something terrible happened." Ellie looked up at her father, her big eyes wide with excitement. "Daddy, I asked if I could see the buttons. I didn't mean to make you worried." Mark's heart softened at the sight of her. He knelt down beside her, still catching his breath. "You should have told me, sweetheart. I was so worried." The pilot chuckled softly. "I'm sorry for the confusion, Mr. Vernhoff. I should have informed the crew. We were just about to wrap up." Mark sighed, the tension in his shoulders finally releasing. "I appreciate you showing her around, but next time please let me know. I was terrified." The pilot nodded. "Of course, sir. I understand completely." Ellie, oblivious to her father's earlier panic, beamed as she pointed to the various buttons and levers in the cockpit. "Look, Daddy. The pilot let me press some of the buttons." Mark couldn't help but smile, despite his earlier fear. "That's amazing, sweetie, but next time you have to promise to let me know where you are, okay?" Ellie nodded, her excitement undiminished. "I will. I promise." After thanking the pilot one last time, Mark took Ellie's hand and led her back through the cabin. His earlier panic had left him feeling drained, but he was just glad she was safe. As they stepped off the plane, Mark realized how lucky he was. His imagination had spiraled out of control, but in the end, Ellie had simply been on a little adventure. As they made their way through the airport, Mark couldn't stop replaying the events in his head. How easily his mind had jumped to the worst conclusions, how his fear had taken over. He glanced down at Ellie, who was happily skipping beside him, oblivious to the turmoil he had just gone through. Once they reached the car, Mark knelt down to Ellie's level and hugged her tightly. "You scared me today, kiddo." Ellie giggled. "I didn't mean to, Daddy. I just wanted to see the plane stuff." Mark kissed the top of her head, the relief washing over him. "I know. I'm just glad you're safe." As they drove away from the airport, Ellie chatted excitedly about her visit to the cockpit, but Mark's mind had shifted to the week ahead. He had 2 full weeks to spend with his daughter, and Disneyland was the first stop. He smiled, grateful that despite the scare, they were together and ready for an unforgettable adventure. As they neared their destination, Mark glanced at Ellie through the rearview mirror. "Next time you fly, no more surprises, okay?" Ellie grinned. "Okay, Daddy. I promise." Mark laughed, the tension from the day finally fading. "Good. Now let's get ready for Disneyland." As they pulled up to Mark's home, the weight of the day began to lift. Ellie bounced out of the car, already talking about what rides she wanted to go on at Disneyland. Mark followed, his heart light again. He couldn't wait to spoil her and make the next 2 weeks unforgettable. All the stress of the day faded away as he focused on the joy ahead. That night, after tucking Ellie into bed, Mark sat quietly in the living room. The fear of losing her earlier had shaken him, but it also made him realize how precious these moments were. His marriage might have ended, but his relationship with Ellie was stronger than ever. He promised himself to never let work or life get in the way of that bond again. Tomorrow was a new day, and it would be filled with nothing but laughter, memories, and their adventure at Disneyland.